Rain poured relentlessly over Boston that night, painting the city in shades of gray as droplets streaked down the tall windows of Massachusetts General Hospital. The usually bustling streets were unusually quiet, save for the occasional car splashing through puddles, their headlights casting fleeting reflections on the wet pavement. Distant ambulance sirens echoed faintly, blending with the steady rhythm of the rain, setting a somber tone for the night. In room 324 of the pediatric wing, Sarah Williams sat beside the small hospital bed where her 3-year-old daughter, Emma, lay motionless. At 36, Sarah had always been known for her composure, but now her face bore the unmistakable signs of exhaustion and grief. Her brown eyes, rimmed red from countless sleepless nights and silent tears, stared at the pale, delicate face of her child. Emma's light blonde curls framed her face, contrasting sharply with the sterile white sheets and the array of medical equipment surrounding her. James Williams, Sarah's husband, stood by the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim glow of the city lights outside. A quiet man by nature, James now looked even more withdrawn. His strong jawline and short-cropped dark hair gave him the appearance of someone who could handle anything, but the slight tremble in his hands betrayed the emotional storm raging within. "She looks so peaceful," Sarah murmured, her voice breaking the heavy silence in the room. "It's almost like she's just asleep." James turned from the window, his gray-blue eyes meeting hers. "She's going to wake up," he said, his tone firm but lined with desperation. "She has to." The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, a cruel reminder of the fragility of their situation. Emma had been in a coma for 3 weeks following a sudden and severe seizure. The doctors had run every test imaginable, but could offer little more than a vague diagnosis and cautious optimism. For Sarah and James, each day was an eternity of waiting, praying, and bracing themselves for the unknown. I can't stop thinking," Sarah began, her voice trembling. "What if—" "Don't say it," James interrupted sharply, his tone more forceful than he intended. He softened his voice, crossing the room to place a hand on her shoulder. "We can't think like that." "Not now," Sarah nodded weakly, but the tears she had been holding back began to spill over. She clutched Emma's tiny hand, her thumb gently tracing the soft skin. "I just want her to open her eyes, James. Just once." James knelt beside her, resting his forehead against hers. "Me too," he whispered. "But she's strong, Sarah. She's a fighter, just like her mom." Outside the room, the faint chatter of nurses and the occasional squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum floors drifted through the hallway. The hospital carried on as if Emma's tiny life hanging in the balance was just another case among many. But to Sarah and James, this room was their entire world, a fragile bubble of hope and fear. As the night wore on, the rain intensified, beating against the window with a relentless rhythm. Sarah leaned back in her chair, clutching a worn, stuffed bunny that had been Emma's favorite toy. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the sound of the rain to drown out the beeping monitors and her own racing thoughts. James returned to his vigil by the window, his mind replaying every moment that had led them to this point. The laughter and joy of their family outings, Emma's infectious giggle, her tiny hands reaching for his face. These memories felt like a cruel contrast to the reality they now faced. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Words felt inadequate in the face of their pain. But as the clock ticked past midnight, a quiet resolve began to settle over them. They would wait, together, for as long as it took. And in the silence of the room, with the rain as their backdrop, hope flickered like a fragile flame. For Sarah and James, it was all they had to hold on to. The small hospital room was a stark reflection of the life it temporarily housed. White walls devoid of personal touches, a cold tiled floor, and a single overhead light that flickered faintly gave the space an impersonal feel. Despite this, Sarah had done her best to make it more comforting for Emma. A colorful blanket embroidered with cartoon characters was draped over the foot of the bed, and a handful of family photos were taped to the wall beside it. A vase of wilting daisies sat on the bedside table, a token from a well-meaning friend who had visited weeks ago. Sarah sat cross-legged in the chair beside Emma's bed, her hands wrapped tightly around a lukewarm cup of coffee. She hadn't had the energy to change out of the oversized sweater she'd been wearing for days. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a messy bun, and faint traces of mascara clung stubbornly to her cheeks. Across the room, James paced back and forth, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans, his expression one of restless frustration. "You should sit," Sarah said, her voice soft but strained. "Pacing isn't going to help." James stopped mid-stride and turned to face her. "Sitting doesn't help either," he replied. "Nothing does. She's just lying there, Sarah. It's like—" He broke off, his voice cracking as he turned away, unwilling to let her see the tears welling in his eyes. "She's still here, James," Sarah said firmly, setting her cup down on the small table beside her. "We can't lose Faith now." James let out a bitter laugh. "Faith? You think Faith is going to bring her back? What we need are answers, Sarah. Not prayers, not wishful thinking. Answers. And what if there aren't any?" Sarah snapped, her voice rising for the first time in days. "What if this is something we can't explain? Does that mean we just give up on her?" The tension in the room was palpable, each of them teetering on the edge of their own breaking point. But before either could say another word, the steady rhythm of the heart monitor suddenly shifted, the beeping becoming erratic for a moment before settling again. Sarah and James froze, their eyes darting to the machine in unison. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. James moved quickly to Emma's side, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. Her small fingers were still warm, but there was no other sign of life. He glanced back at the monitor, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's probably nothing," he said, more to reassure himself than Sarah. "Maybe a glitch." But Sarah wasn't so sure. She leaned over Emma, her hand gently brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. "Emma," she murmured, her voice breaking. "Baby, can you hear me?" There was no response. The room fell silent once more, save for the faint hum of the machines. But for Sarah, that brief moment of irregularity felt like a lifeline, a reminder that Emma was still fighting. As the night dragged on, the air in the room grew heavier, the weight of their emotions pressing down on them like a physical force. James eventually sank into a chair by the window, his head in his hands. "I feel so useless," he admitted quietly, his voice barely audible over the steady beeping of the monitors. "I'm her dad. I'm supposed to protect her, but I can't do anything." "You're here," Sarah said softly, reaching out to place a hand on his knee. "That's what matters. Emma knows we're here." James looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen. "Do you think she can feel it? That we're with her?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I do. I have to believe she can." The quiet exchange brought a fragile sense of peace to the room, even if only for a moment. Outside, the first rays of dawn began to creep over the city, casting a faint golden light through the rain-streaked window. It was a new day, a small reminder that life, despite everything, continued to move forward. The pale morning light filtered into the hospital room, painting soft patterns on the walls as the sun peeked through the lingering clouds. James and Sarah sat in silence, their exhaustion evident in their slumped postures and weary expressions. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor provided a strange sort of comfort, a constant amidst the uncertainty. A faint breeze stirred the room, drawing Sarah's attention to the slightly cracked window. She frowned, certain it had been closed the night before. Rising from her chair, she crossed the room to shut it fully, but as she reached for the handle, something caught her eye. "James," she said softly, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Look." James turned to see a small white dove perched on the window ledge, its feathers pristine and shimmering in the morning light. It tilted its head as if studying the room before it flapped its wings and hopped inside. "Is that—" James started, his voice trailing off as the bird landed on the back of a chair near Emma's bed. Neither of them moved, afraid that any sudden action might startle the unexpected visitor. The dove stood perfectly still, its dark, beady eyes focused on Emma. The surreal moment felt almost sacred, as if the bird's presence carried a significance they couldn't yet understand. "What's it doing here?" James whispered, breaking the silence. Sarah shook her head, her eyes never leaving the dove. "I don't know, but it feels like it's here for a reason." James raised an eyebrow. A bird in a hospital room doesn't exactly scream good omen. Sarah shot him a look. "It doesn't feel random, James. Look at it." As if in response to her words, the dove fluttered to the edge of Emma's bed, its small claws barely making a sound on the metal rail. It stood there for a moment, its gaze unwavering. Then, as Sarah and James watched in stunned silence, the bird spread its wings slightly, almost as if shielding the child. James ran a hand through his hair, his skepticism giving way to unease. "Should we call someone? Maybe it's diseased or—" "Stop," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. "Just stop. Look at Emma." James glanced at their daughter and felt his breath catch in his throat. The steady beeping of the heart monitor had grown slightly stronger, the peaks and valleys of the lines on the screen more pronounced. It was a subtle change, but one that neither of them could ignore. "Did that just—" James began, his voice faltering. Sarah nodded, her hand flying to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. "She's improving. It's just a coincidence," James said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It has to be, does it?" Sarah countered, her tone challenging. "What if it's not?" The dove remained by Emma's bedside, unmoving. It seemed to emanate a sense of calm that filled the room, easing the tension that had gripped Sarah and James for weeks. Sarah stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached out a hand, stopping just short of the bird. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James watched her, a mixture of disbelief and hope flickering in his eyes. "You think this bird is what? Some kind of sign?" Sarah turned to him, her expression resolute. "I don't know what it is, James, but I can feel it. It's here for her." The dove finally moved, flapping its wings once before settling back into place. It stayed for a few more minutes, its presence almost protective, before it took off, flying out the window as gracefully as it had entered. James and Sarah stood in stunned silence, the room feeling strangely empty without the bird. The sound of the heart monitor brought them back to reality, its steadier rhythm offering a glimmer of hope they hadn't felt in weeks. "It's not just a bird," Sarah said quietly, her eyes fixed on Emma. "It's more than that." James didn't respond, his gaze lingering on the open window. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a reason to hope. The following day dawned brighter, the sun cutting through the residual clouds to bathe Boston in a warm glow. In room 324, the atmosphere felt subtly different. The weight that had lingered for weeks seemed to have lifted, even if only slightly. Sarah sat at Emma's bedside, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's small one, while James stood by the window, staring out at the city below. The heart monitor beeped steadily, its sound now oddly comforting. As Sarah absently smoothed Emma's blanket, the memory of the dove's visit replayed in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that it had been a turning point, even if she couldn't explain why. "James," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "I think she's going to be okay." He turned to her, his expression guarded. "Sarah, we can't let ourselves get too hopeful. You know what the doctors said." "I know," she replied, her gaze never leaving Emma. "But something's changed. I can feel it." Before James could respond, a small movement caught their attention. Sarah froze, her breath hitching as Emma's fingers twitched under her hand. "James, did you see that?" He rushed to her side, his eyes wide as he stared at their daughter. "What happened?" "Her fingers," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "They moved." For a moment, They both stared in silence, willing it to happen again. And then, as if in response to their prayers, Emma's hand shifted, her tiny fingers curling ever so slightly around Sarah's. "Oh my God," Sarah choked out, tears streaming down her face. "She's responding." James reached out, his own hand covering Sarah's as they both held onto Emma's small hand. "Emma," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "Baby, can you hear us?" The heart monitor's beeping grew stronger, its rhythm quickening slightly as Emma's chest rose and fell in deeper breaths. Though her eyes remained closed, the subtle changes were undeniable. She was there, fighting her way back to them. Sarah leaned closer, her voice trembling with hope. "Emma, it's Mommy. If you can hear me, squeeze my hand again." For a moment, nothing happened. But then, with deliberate effort, Emma's fingers tightened around Sarah's hand. The small gesture felt monumental, like the first crack in a dam holding back a flood of emotions. James let out a shaky laugh, his tears falling freely now. "She's in there. She's really in there." Sarah nodded, unable to speak as she clung to her daughter's hand. Her heart swelled with a mixture of relief and overwhelming love. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, it felt winnable. The sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway broke the moment as Dr. Patel, Emma's lead physician, entered the room, followed closely by a nurse. "What's going on?" she asked, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "She moved," Sarah said quickly, her voice filled with urgency. "She squeezed my hand." Dr. Patel moved to Emma's bedside, her demeanor professional yet kind. "Let me take a look," she said, pulling on a pair of gloves. She gently lifted Emma's hand, her experienced fingers checking for reflexes and muscle response. After a moment, she turned to Sarah and James, a small smile playing on her lips. "This is a good sign," she said. "Her nervous system is responding. It's not a full recovery, but it's progress." Sarah clung to those words like a lifeline. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Dr. Patel glanced at the monitor, her expression thoughtful. "We'll continue to monitor her closely. The fact that she's responding means her brain activity is improving. This could be the start of her waking up." James let out a deep breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Dr. Patel nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "She's a fighter. Keep talking to her." Sometimes, hearing familiar voices can make all the difference. As the doctor and nurse left the room, Sarah and James turned back to Emma, their hearts filled with renewed hope. Sarah leaned down, her lips brushing against Emma's forehead. "We're here, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're not going anywhere." James pulled a chair to the other side of the bed, his hand joining Sarah's as they both held onto their daughter. For the first time in weeks, the weight in the room felt lighter, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of optimism. The fight wasn't over, but Emma had taken her first step back to them. And for Sarah and James, that was enough to keep believing. The hospital room had grown quieter as the hours passed, the occasional murmur of staff in the hallway fading into the background. Inside, Sarah and James remained seated on either side of Emma's bed, their hands resting gently on hers. The tension of the past weeks had begun to ease, replaced by an almost sacred sense of connection. Emma's slight movements earlier in the day had reignited a hope that neither of them had realized they'd nearly lost. The room, though still sterile and clinical, felt transformed. The soft hum of the machines no longer sounded menacing. Instead, it became a rhythmic reminder of life. Sarah looked down at Emma's peaceful face, her light blonde curls slightly matted against the pillow. She reached out, smoothing a stray strand with a tenderness that only a mother could manage. "I used to love watching her sleep," Sarah said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was warm but laced with sorrow. "I'd sit by her crib for hours, just staring at her little face, listening to her breathe." James looked at her, his expression thoughtful. She used to make that little snorting sound when she was a baby, he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips, like a tiny piglet. Remember? Sarah chuckled, though it came out more like a sob. I used to call her my little piggy. She hated it when she got older. James smiled at the memory, his gaze shifting to Emma. She's always been stubborn, hasn't she? Even as a toddler, she'd refuse to take her nap unless I sang that ridiculous cowboy song. Sarah laughed softly. You were so bad at it, too. But she didn't care. She'd just smile at you like you were the best singer in the world. The room grew quiet again, the weight of their shared memories filling the space. Sarah reached for Emma's hand, her fingers trembling slightly. I feel like I failed her, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I should have known something was wrong. I should have done more. Sarah, James said firmly, leaning forward to meet her eyes. You didn't fail her. None of this is your fault. But what if I missed something? She pressed, tears spilling down her cheeks. What if I could have stopped this from happening? James reached across the bed, taking her free hand in his. You've done everything you could. More than that. She knows how much you love her, and that's what matters. Sarah nodded, though her tears continued to fall. I just want her to know we're here, that we're not giving up on her. She knows, James said, his voice steady. And she's fighting, Sarah, just like we are. As if in response to his words, Emma's hand twitched again, her fingers curling slightly around Sarah's. Both parents froze, their eyes widening as they looked down at their daughter. Emma, Sarah whispered, her heart pounding. Can you hear me, sweetheart? James leaned in closer, his breath catching in his throat. Emma, it's Daddy. If you can hear us, give Mommy's hand another squeeze. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly but deliberately, Emma's fingers tightened around Sarah's hand. The movement was faint, but it was enough to bring tears streaming down both their faces. Oh my God, Sarah said, her voice trembling. She's really there. She can hear us. James wiped at his eyes, his lips quivering as he smiled. I told you she's a fighter. The door opened quietly, and a nurse stepped in, her eyes widening as she saw Sarah and James crying. Is everything okay? She asked, concern evident in her tone. She moved, Sarah said quickly, her voice filled with emotion. She's responding to us. The nurse's expression softened as she approached the bed. That's incredible, she said, her voice kind. Let's take a look. As the nurse checked Emma's vitals, Sarah and James remained at her side, their hands never leaving hers. They exchanged a look of shared determination, their bond stronger than ever. In that moment, the room wasn't just a hospital room. It was a sanctuary of hope, love, and unwavering faith. And as they watched over their daughter, they knew they would do whatever it took to bring her back to them. The following morning, the hospital bustled with its usual energy. Doctors made their rounds, nurses hurried from room to room, and the soft murmur of conversations filled the halls. In room 324, however, Sarah and James were immersed in a different reality, a fragile mix of hope and disbelief. Dr. Patel entered the room with her usual calm demeanor, her tablet in hand. She greeted Sarah and James with a polite nod before glancing at Emma's chart. I've been updated on her movements, she began, her tone professional yet cautious. While this is promising, I want to emphasize that recovery in cases like Emma's is rarely linear. These responses could be reflexive rather than indicative of conscious awareness. James, sitting by the window with a coffee cup clasped in both hands, frowned. Reflexive, he echoed, his voice sharp. She squeezed Sarah's hand. Twice. That's not just a reflex. Dr. Patel looked at him sympathetically but remained firm. Mr. Williams, I understand how much you want this to mean she's waking up, but we have to approach this with a clinical perspective. The brain is complex, and small movements don't always signify full recovery. Sarah, sitting on the edge of Emma's bed, placed a protective hand over her daughter's. But her heart rate has improved, she argued. Her voice steady despite the tears brimming in her eyes. And she responded to our voices. Doesn't that mean something? Dr. Patel hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. It's not insignificant, she admitted, but it's too early to draw conclusions. We'll continue monitoring her closely, and I'll order additional tests to see if there are any changes in her neurological activity. James set his coffee down, the ceramic cup clinking against the windowsill. Tests, he muttered. That's all we ever hear. Tests, theories, and probabilities. But what about what we're seeing? What about what we feel? Dr. Patel sighed softly, her expression softening. I know this is difficult, and I don't want to discount what you're experiencing. But as a physician, I have to rely on evidence to guide my recommendations. Sarah's shoulders slumped, her hope dampened by the doctor's clinical detachment. She's more than evidence to us, she said quietly, her gaze fixed on Emma. She's our little girl. Dr. Patel's expression softened further, and for a moment, the distance between doctor and parents seemed to shrink. I understand, she said gently, and I truly hope Emma's movements are a sign of something more. But we need to be cautious in our expectations. After Dr. Patel left the room, Sarah and James sat in silence, the weight of her words pressing down on them. The tension in the room was palpable, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, James broke the silence. Why does it feel like they don't want to believe she's getting better? He asked, his voice tinged with frustration. It's not that, Sarah replied, though she sounded unsure. They just don't want to give us false hope. James shook his head, his jaw tightening. Hope isn't false if it's real to us. Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his. Do you really think she's coming back to us? James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I don't just think it, he said firmly. I know it. I felt it when she squeezed your hand. And when that dove was here, it wasn't just a coincidence, Sarah. It was something more. Sarah nodded slowly, her faith reigniting with his words. I felt it too, she admitted. It was like she was trying to tell us she's still here. Then we hold on to that, James said, his voice resolute. No matter what they say, no matter how long it takes, we hold on to her. Sarah reached across the bed, taking James's hand in hers. Together, she said softly. We'll get her back together. The room fell silent again, but this time, the quiet was filled with determination rather than despair. Outside the window, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the city. It was a subtle reminder that even after the darkest storms, light could still find its way through. The night started like many others in room 324, quiet, with the low hum of the machines punctuating the stillness. Sarah and James had settled into their respective routines. Sarah holding Emma's hand while softly speaking to her, and James stationed near the window, staring out at the city lights. But this night was destined to be different. Around midnight, the heart monitor's steady beeping shifted. The sudden, erratic rhythm sliced through the quiet, and both Sarah and James sprang to attention. What's happening? Sarah cried, her voice filled with panic as she leaned over Emma. The monitor's irregular beeping grew louder, almost frantic. James pressed the emergency button near the bed. We need help, he shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. Within seconds, a team of nurses and Dr. Patel rushed into the room. The atmosphere shifted to one of controlled chaos as the medical team surrounded Emma, checking her vitals and adjusting the equipment. Her oxygen levels are dropping, one nurse reported, her voice steady despite the tension. Prepare to intubate, Dr. Patel ordered, her hands moving quickly as she assessed the situation. Sarah clung to James, her body trembling as tears streamed down her face. What's happening to her? She pleaded. Is she? She's going to be okay, James interrupted, his voice firm but cracking at the edges. He pulled Sarah into his arms, holding her tightly as they watched helplessly. Minutes felt like hours as the team worked to stabilize Emma. The sound of the heart monitor, now wild and uneven, was almost unbearable. Sarah buried her face in James's chest, her muffled sobs breaking the silence between them. "I can't lose her," she whispered. "I can't." "You won't," James said, though his own voice betrayed his fear. "She's stronger than this." As the medical team continued their efforts, Sarah's gaze darted to the window. It was closed, but a faint glow seemed to emanate from outside, a soft, unearthly light that caught her attention. She broke away from James and moved closer to the window, her heart pounding. "What are you doing?" James asked, but Sarah didn't answer. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the glass. The light seemed to grow brighter for a moment, and Sarah closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer. "Please," she whispered, "please, let her stay with us." Behind her, the heart monitor's erratic beeping began to steady. The shift was subtle at first, but then it became unmistakable, a rhythm returning to normalcy. "Her vitals are stabilizing," Dr. Patel said, relief evident in her tone. The tension in the room began to ease as the medical team stepped back, their movements slowing. Sarah turned back to Emma, her heart leaping as she saw the color returning to her daughter's face. She rushed to the bedside, her hands trembling as she reached for Emma's. "Is she okay?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Dr. Patel nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "She's stable now. It was a close call, but she pulled through." James exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging as the weight of the moment hit him. "Thank God," he murmured, moving to Sarah's side and wrapping his arm around her. The nurses began cleaning up, and Dr. Patel turned to Sarah and James. "This was a significant moment," she said. "Emma's resilience is remarkable, but this was a reminder of how critical her condition still is. We need to remain vigilant." Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving Emma. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." After the medical team left, the room fell into a heavy silence. Sarah and James stayed close to Emma, their hands joined as they watched over her. "Did you see it?" Sarah finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" James replied, his brow furrowing. "The light," Sarah said, turning to him. "Outside the window." It was there, just before her vitals stabilized. James looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "I didn't see anything. But if you did, maybe it means something." "It means she's not alone," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. Someone is watching over her." James nodded slowly, his hand tightening around hers. "Then we keep believing, no matter what." They sat in silence for the rest of the night, their faith in Emma and in whatever force was guiding her, stronger than ever. The days following Emma's crisis were filled with an air of cautious optimism. Her vitals had remained steady, and the small, incremental signs of improvement were impossible for Sarah and James to ignore. Though the medical staff continued to temper their expectations with realism, the hope in room 324 was palpable. It was late afternoon, the sun casting golden streaks across the walls, when Sarah noticed something different. She had been reading aloud from one of Emma's favorite storybooks, her voice soft and soothing, when she felt the faintest tug on her hand. "James," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Come here." James, who had been standing near the window scrolling through emails on his phone, turned quickly. "What is it?" She moved again, Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. "I felt it." Her hand. James rushed to her side, his heart pounding as he looked at Emma's still form. "Emma," he said gently, his voice thick with emotion. "It's Daddy. If you can hear us, squeeze Mommy's hand." For a long moment, there was nothing but the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Sarah held her breath, her eyes fixed on Emma's face. Then, slowly, Emma's fingers curled around Sarah's hand, weak but deliberate. "Oh my God," Sarah choked out, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She's there. She's really there." James knelt by the bed, his hands covering Sarah's and Emma's. "Emma," he said again, his voice breaking. "Sweetheart, can you try to open your eyes for us?" The room seemed to hold its breath as they waited. Slowly, impossibly, Emma's eyelids fluttered. Her lashes trembled and then, for the first time in weeks, her bright blue eyes opened, squinting against the sunlight streaming through the window. "Emma," Sarah sobbed, her free hand flying to cover her mouth. "You're awake." Emma's gaze shifted sluggishly, her eyes unfocused but unmistakably alive. Her lips moved, barely forming words. "Mommy, Daddy." James let out a laugh that was equal parts joy and disbelief. "We're here, baby," he said, his voice shaking. "We're right here." Sarah leaned in, her tears falling freely as she stroked Emma's hair. "You're okay," she whispered. "You're safe." A nurse, who had just stepped into the room to check on Emma, froze in the doorway, her eyes wide. "I'll get Dr. Patel," she said quickly, disappearing down the hall. By the time Dr. Patel arrived moments later, Emma was fully awake, her small hand gripping Sarah's tightly. The doctor conducted a quick assessment, her usually composed demeanor slipping into something resembling amazement. "This is remarkable," Dr. Patel said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Emma's progress is beyond what we anticipated. She's not just stable, she's recovering." "What does this mean?" James asked, his voice hoarse. "Is she going to be okay?" Dr. Patel hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "This is an excellent sign," she said, "but we need to take things one step at a time. Her body has been through a lot, and she'll need extensive therapy to rebuild her strength. But yes, this is a very good sign." Sarah and James exchanged a look of overwhelming relief and gratitude. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they allowed themselves to truly believe that their little girl was coming back to them. As the medical staff began making preparations for Emma's next steps, Sarah and James remained at her side, their hands never leaving hers. Emma's eyes fluttered closed again, her small body exhausted from the effort of waking, but her breathing was steady, her presence undeniable. "She's a miracle," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with awe. James nodded, his hand resting gently on Emma's. "She's our miracle." Outside the window, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the room in a warm, golden light. For the first time, the darkness that had loomed over them felt like it was finally beginning to lift. The next few days passed in a haze of cautious celebration. Emma's condition continued to improve steadily, her small voice growing stronger with each passing hour. Though she still tired easily, her personality began to peek through in fleeting moments. Her quiet giggle, the way her eyes lit up when Sarah read her favorite story, or the faint smile she gave James when he made one of his silly jokes. On the third morning since her awakening, Sarah arrived at the hospital with a small bouquet of fresh daisies. She carefully replaced the wilted ones on the bedside table, their bright white petals seeming to reflect the joy that had returned to the room. "Good morning, sunshine," she said, leaning over to kiss Emma's forehead. Emma blinked up at her, her blue eyes clear and curious. "Mommy," she said softly, her voice still raspy but filled with warmth. "I dreamed about a bird." Sarah froze, her hand pausing mid-stroke through Emma's hair. "A bird?" she asked gently. "What kind of bird?" "Sweetheart?" "A white one," Emma replied. "It was in my room. It wasn't scary. It made me feel happy." Sarah's throat tightened as tears threatened to spill from her eyes. She glanced at James, who had just walked into the room carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. He caught her expression and set the cups down, moving to sit on the edge of Emma's bed. "A white bird, huh?" James said, his voice light but tinged with emotion. "What did it do in your dream?" Emma shrugged weakly, her small shoulders barely moving. "It just stayed by me. I think it wanted me to wake up." Sarah and James exchanged a look, their unspoken thoughts reflected in each other's eyes. Neither of them said anything, but the memory of the dove's visit hung heavy between them. That evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, the hospital room was filled with a warm, golden light. Emma had fallen asleep after her physical therapy session, her tiny body tucked beneath a soft blanket. Sarah sat beside her, humming a lullaby, while James read quietly in the chair near the window. A sudden flutter of wings drew their attention. Startled, James set his book down as Sarah turned toward the sound. There, perched on the window ledge, was the white dove. Its pristine feathers seemed to shimmer in the fading sunlight, and its dark eyes fixed on Emma. "It's back," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. She reached out instinctively, her hand trembling. James stood, moving to join her by the window. "Do you think it came to say goodbye?" The dove tilted its head, its movements graceful and deliberate. It didn't step into the room this time, but it remained on the ledge, watching. Then, with a soft coo, it spread its wings and took off, its silhouette glowing against the vibrant colors of the sunset. Sarah watched it disappear into the distance, her hand clutching James's tightly. "It was here for her," she said quietly. "I don't know how or why, but it was." James nodded, his voice steady but filled with wonder. "Maybe it was just reminding us that she's going to be okay." As the last rays of sunlight faded, the room fell into a peaceful quiet. Sarah and James turned their attention back to Emma, their hearts full of gratitude and an unshakable sense of hope. The dove had come and gone, leaving behind a gift far greater than they could have ever imagined. Faith in the resilience of their little girl and the power of love to see them through even the darkest of times. Months had passed since that extraordinary evening when the dove returned. Emma had continued her recovery, surpassing every expectation set by her medical team. Though the road to full health was long and demanding, each small milestone felt like a triumph. Her laughter now echoed in their home, filling the spaces that had once been so quiet. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah and James sat on the porch of their small suburban home just outside Boston. Emma played in the yard, her golden curls catching the sunlight as she giggled, chasing bubbles that floated lazily in the breeze. Her favorite stuffed bunny, now slightly worn from years of love, sat in the grass beside her. "Look at her," Sarah said softly, her eyes welling with tears. "She's so full of life again. There were days I didn't think we'd ever see this." James reached for her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "She's a miracle," he said, his voice steady. "And so are you, Sarah. You never stopped believing." Sarah smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I couldn't have done it without you. We were strong together." As they watched Emma blow another set of bubbles, James said, "Do you ever think about the dove?" "All the time," Sarah admitted. "It wasn't just a bird, James. It was more than that. It brought us hope when we had none." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think about how close we came to losing her, and I can't help but believe that someone, was looking out for us. That dove, the timing of it all. It feels like more than coincidence. It's why I think we need to share her story," Sarah said, her voice growing more resolute. "There are so many families out there, just like us, who are waiting, praying, holding on to hope. If Emma's story can give them even a little bit of strength, then we have to tell it." James smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "You're right. People need to know that even in the darkest times, there's always a reason to hold on." Over the next few weeks, Sarah and James began sharing their story. They spoke at local hospitals, joined support groups for parents of critically ill children, and even wrote an article for a national parenting magazine. They didn't just talk about Emma's miraculous recovery. They shared the struggles, the moments of doubt, and the power of faith and resilience. Their story touched countless lives. Parents wrote to them, thanking them for their honesty and courage. Some shared their own stories of loss and recovery, while others said Emma's journey had inspired them to keep fighting for their children. One letter stood out in particular. It came from a mother in California whose daughter had been in a coma for 2 months. "Your story reminded me to keep talking to my daughter, even when it felt hopeless," the letter read. "Yesterday, she squeezed my hand for the first time. Thank you for giving me the strength to believe." Sarah read the letter aloud to James one evening, tears streaming down her face. "This is why we had to tell her story," she said. It's not just about Emma. It's about hope. As the sun set that evening, the family gathered in the yard. Emma, still holding her stuffed bunny, looked up at the sky. "Mommy, look," she exclaimed, pointing. Sarah and James followed her gaze and saw a single white dove gliding across the orange and pink horizon. It disappeared into the distance, leaving behind a sense of peace that filled them all. "Do you think it's the same one?" Emma asked, her voice filled with wonder. Sarah knelt beside her daughter, wrapping her arms around her. "Maybe," she said with a smile. "Or maybe it's just here to remind us how far we've come." James joined them, his arms encircling them both. Together, they watched the sky, their hearts full of gratitude and the unshakable belief that miracles, whether big or small, were always possible. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving.